Hey everyone, my name is Barack, and I wanted to kind of give a quick overview of computer graphics for anyone who's kind of new to it or wants a refresher, or is just generally curious about like what it is exactly when people talk about it. So the big question for this first half of the talk is just what is computer graphics? Does anyone have like a quick guess as to what it is? Yep.
Designing things on a computer.
That's part of it. So computer graphics is used to design things on the computer. It doesn't always have to be 3D, it could be 2D as well. So I guess as part of the question of what it is, it's good to know where it's used, just to help us understand what it is overall. So computer graphics is used in feature films. You guys have probably seen like Pixar movies, Disney movies, a lot of 3D there. Computer graphics is heavily used in that space. It's also used in television and commercials. In fact, a lot of the modern computer graphics that we appreciate today had like its kind of head start from marketing ads and commercials. Those were generally the initial clients to help push the technology forward, especially in the early years. Video games. Video games heavily takes advantage of computer graphics. In fact, it'd be argued that you can't really play video games without it, with the exception, of course, of like text-based games and things like that. But computer graphics is pivotal for video games. And then with all of those kinds of foundational industries, you tend to see it in TV and commercials, which kind of like plays off of film. You could see it in AR, or augmented reality, virtual reality, mobile apps, things like that. You can see it, again, in virtual reality, and you could see it, like, again, in augmented reality on your phone or with, like, HoloLens or whatever. It's also utilized, interestingly enough, in 3D printing. You tend to start with computer graphics to visualize what you want to print or fabricate, and then 3D printing comes in to help make those designs come to life. So just to give a little bit of background, in the very, very early years of computer graphics, computer scientists would use vector graphics to draw shapes, and they would essentially draw 2D and simulate 3D shapes using like traditional art techniques to render things on a display. And then over time, vector graphics, of course, has its strengths, but one of the weaknesses is it's all lines. So in order to get more like texture, to simulate lighting and shading, there was a move to raster graphics, which is just like a per pixel render of things. And that raster graphics kind of opened up a lot of possibilities, like rendering people. And in this case, there's early days of animation where you could take like 3D graphics that would be rendered with raster graphics, and you can move every single point on a 3D model over time to animate something. Eventually, film industries started taking on computer graphics and making big projects, which helped the technology make leaps forward, and Tron was an early example of a Disney film that was done with computer graphics. There was a big leap in the 90s when Jurassic Park came out to prove this idea that computer graphics can be used to create realistic imagery that could work side by side with film. And Pixar came out with a lot of big strides for computer graphics to prove that you could create an entire feature film with 3D computer graphics. And in the meantime, while that was happening, video games were evolving, especially in the 90s, where computer graphics originally were pixel art, or sprite-based graphics that were two-dimensional, and eventually leaped into three-dimensional computer graphics that you would previously see in film, but now you can play it, and it updates 15 times a second instead of taking hours per image. So this is just kind of like an overall time line of computer graphics. Everything from the vector-based graphics in the 60s to the modern graphics that we appreciate today. So you can see these big leaps, especially in film, where that first image on the left is a Toy Story from, I think, the 1990s. And then all the way to like Toy Story 3, which was about 20, 30 years later, you could just see a giant leap in quality and what can be done with computer graphics. In this case, there's a lot of like lighting and shading and resolution that's like increased over those years. You see another giant leap with 3D computer graphics in games, where instead of seeing low, blocky, polygonal objects, you could start seeing 3D renders that start looking a lot like film. And yeah, you could see here that in games, especially in modern games, it's starting to become harder and harder to differentiate between a video game and a movie. This image was rendered 60 times a second, and it took about 7 hours just for the one image. But again, like, you could see that the lines are getting blurrier, even though you could tell that this bottom image is probably a little nicer. Quick question, do you think that this image was rendered with video game technology or with film technology? Yep. Oh, well, there we go. He's got the inside scoop. Yes, correct. This image was rendered with game technology, so this actually updates 60 times a second, or at least at the time, like 30. So how do computers create these 3D images? Well, we tend to start with like a 3D grid or 3D, space. And we have 3 axes, X, Y, and Z. So if you're used to doing geometry and stuff where you have a 2-dimensional plane where you can map or plot vectors and points, if you expand that to a 3rd dimension, now you have the ability to start plotting points and positions in 3D space, which you can eventually draw. So typically for a 3D model, you would have vertex information. A vertex is just a point in 3D space. When you have multiple vertices in relation to each other, they connect, they start creating polygons, and those polygons are just kind of like represented in that 3D space. On the computer, or on any display, the computer is broken up into pixels, just like run across vertically and horizontally. Those 3D pixels, or those 3D positions or vertices in space, are transposed onto the 2D screen, and wherever those pixels are visible, or those vertices are visible, or polygons are visible, the screen will start rendering it along those pixels. So it looks something like this. You would have 3 vertices, they turn into a polygon, and then the screen would render that polygon like across. So you could take these polygons or renders, and you could start rendering those polygons in different ways and layering them on top of each other until you get like a final image, so like a composite. And it could look something like this. The beauty render that you see on the left is a composite of all the different, of the same scene rendered in different ways to give you different information, stacked on top of each other with some math to give you a final image of, in this case, like a realistic room. So that's kind of that's like a deferred rendering approach where you just render a scene multiple times for different reasons, and then you blend everything together to create a perfect, like a good image. But it requires you to kind of render each image like as planes that you merge. For more realistic rendering that tends to take longer but can yield more accurate, physically accurate results, we rely on something called path tracing, which you'll tend to see more in film. But games does not exclude this technique. The idea of path tracing is that you have a light source, and the light source emits light rays, and the light rays bounce around objects, and each object has properties that reflect light in different ways. There's nearly infinite amount of light rays that just emit from a light source and bounce around and then hit your eye. Of course, like to simulate this, you'd have to simulate a light source, all the rays hitting in all different directions, hitting different surfaces, bouncing around, and eventually getting to your eye. There's a lot to compute. So what path tracing does, so this is a ton to compute. Computers can't really do this. So typically what we do is we do it in the reverse. We have the camera angle, we shoot rays out of the camera, bounce that around objects till it hits a light source. And then when it hits the correct light sources, we return a color back. And that allows us to kind of simulate all that the light is doing, but only for what you see. So it's just an optimization that allows to make this process possible. So instead of doing all of this, calculating all of this, we're just calculating what we need. And it cleans up the scene and and what you want to see is what the computer will process. And to create 3D content, so you can have something to render, there's typically, especially for creative projects, there's typically like a pipeline or a workflow that's required to create like the final render. And so like we can look at a character as an example. The first step is the design step. So if you're creating a new character or character from scratch, you tend to start with the design phase where you kind of concept out, draw out the character until you start imagining, or until you have a good tangible grasp of what the character will look like. This is deciding its shape, its like color values, its overall appeal and style. From there, you could take that concept or that illustration and you can create a 3D model. So the idea, going back to the idea of creating those vertices, which create polygons, which create a shape that you can render, you could author a complex geometry. It doesn't have to be spheres or cubes. It can be something like sort of organic like this, just to kind of house the shape of the character that you wish to create. And that will just be represented as vertices and polygons. After that, you would want to be able to color it, like texture it, or paint it, essentially. And so the first thing you want to do is take all of those polygons that you've kind of created and structured together, and you want to create a two-dimensional representation of them that's flat, that you can actually paint on. So this is an example of UVing, is what we call it, to do that like mapping of a 3D object back to 2D. So imagine this cube is 3D, and we want to like spread it out so that it's two-dimensional. We can paint over it. We would essentially do something like this, where we would take all the polygons and just spread them out. So you can see there's different ways of doing UVing. Even with a sphere, depending on like how the polygons are arranged, you can organize the polygons in such a way where when you lay them flat, you could take a sphere, lay it flat into a plane, and project an image on it. In this case, you could take a sphere, lay it flat, and then apply like a map of the world that's two-dimensional that will contour back around the 3D object. So we take all these same principles for this little character, and we have UVs for that character, and that UV gets painted. So you can see in the middle we have these textures that we painted, or they're just basically 2D images that have color values and different like useful values to render the final model. And yeah, so we just have these clean color values that we just paint on top of those UVs. And you can see at the end, once everything's painted, you can see how from the 2D plane, the colors that map to that plane, to those polygons in 2D space, they start to appear in the correct spot on the 3D model. So how do you create all that? There's a lot of fun tools that are out for you to, some of them are free, some of them are, you pay for it. Blender, for example, is free. There are 3D digital content creation tools that are available that allow you to do all of this creation process. And for rendering, if you want, especially if you want to do real-time rendering like for games, there's a lot of engines that are available mostly for free, especially for experimentation if you want to build something personal, that you could just spin up and just like load your 3D objects in there and have it do fun, creative things. Yeah, so that's the overview. Does anyone have any questions about, the computer graphics or what we kind of talked about?
I have a question about green screens. We answered that Jurassic Park.
Oh, sure. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the green screens, so going back to the compositing step, you can use the same kind of compositing tools to layer images on top to cut out certain images. And what's kind of fun about that is in the old days, when they didn't use computers to do those kinds of like layering, they would tend to take glass doors, like shower doors, and they would paint on them, and they would leave the transparent stuff transparent on the glass, and they would stack the glass doors on top of each other to make a final image. And so you could take a lot of those same principles from like using those glass panels on the computer to do the same kind of thing. And for green screening, especially on the computer, you can identify where on the image is that green color, and then you can like subtract it and make it transparent. And then from there, you create these like plates that you can layer on top, and you can layer the 3D in there as well. Typically, on the, when you're rendering something in 3D, you can always like render invisible pixels or transparent pixels. So that way you have a clean cutout, and then you can start layering things on top of each other. There tends to be, let me see if I can jump back really quick. There tends to be, oh, you can see it here. So there's a rendering pass you can do that's purely just there to identify the silhouette or the shape of every object. And you can use this kind of stuff to do like that green screen you were talking about per object. Just cut out each thing and separate it so that you can like control like how bright or how colorful something is on a per object basis. Yep.
Is the second one from the right?
Second from, oh, this bluish with all the lines?
Is that a heat?
It kind of works like one. I think this one is designed to highlight contours, like edges around the objects, so that you can do like, you can like push and pull shadows and edges. So say like you wanted to render your chair, but you wanted to kind of like give it a glow or something around the edges, you could render a pass like this one that detects the edges, so that way you can like brighten or darken the outline of your chair. But I think this probably serves a different purpose. Sometimes there's like very common purposes, like this one, like I mentioned, just to do cutouts. The one at the second one to the left is more for like just color, pure color information, and then you figure out lighting from there. The third one, kind of in the middle, that black and white one, is more of just like specular lighting. So which thing, like just lighting information, just isolated to black and white. And then the one next to that is normal information, so like light, like how light is reflected back. And of course, when it's all layered together, it works. And then sometimes you have stuff that's a little more custom that serves like a single purpose. This is probably, my guess is it is like contours or like cavity maps, so you could see, you can isolate like cracks and little divots and stuff. Yep.
I noticed that the third one from the left
Yeah.
has a different background out the window than the one on the far right.
Oh, the like the background color out of the window is like gray versus like purple.
No, I mean, like, out of this window,
Yeah.
there's a building,
Oh, for sure.
and out of that window, there's not a building.
Yeah, and you could probably imagine that they took this pass and picked all the pixels that were this color, they subtracted that out and replaced it with a picture of a building outside. So that way you don't have to even worry about that building or anything outside. You could just make a mask here and then put anything you want outside. So it's like a little technique, so you don't have to process an entire building outside. You could take a photo and then you can like composite it into the scene, and it looks like realistic and pleasant.
You
Yeah.
have to subtract, like, the pictures so they can
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and you can do that here, where you could just like select each piece and then subtract it and put something else in entirely. So it's kind of like the green screening thing. You could like green screen out the window here with these like kind of magenta-ish, dark magenta pixels. And then you replace it with whatever you want. It's just more complex because it's like a bunch of breakup and stuff in that green screen. Cool.
Do like modern day filters and stuff like that use AR?
Oh yeah. So there's let me go to this slide. I don't know if this will help read it. Actually, you know what? Let me go back. I think it was back here. Oh no, it's all good. This is like the fun part. Let's go to the slide where we just show AR. So what cameras on phones can do now, especially the ones that have like LiDAR sensors, is that they can use depth from the LiDAR to kind of figure out like where you are and where the background is, and then it can auto composite. Like it can cut the whole background out, replace it. So like if you do a Zoom call and you see how people like can magically blur their background but not themselves, a lot of times even with a webcam, but especially with a phone camera, you can like use either AI or like compositing tricks to identify the head, and then you create a plate out of it. So you can like almost green screen. If you can detect the head, you can green screen everything else out and either replace it with a blurred image of itself or replace it with something completely different. And with AR, it's like super important because you're going to want to composite your 3D objects into the real world. So like in film, how you can composite 3D renders into a film, augmented reality kind of does that on steroids, just like every frame on your phone constantly, and it's also tracking so that it maps and lines up with the stuff around you. So it's pretty like crazy. It's like taking old film techniques and like making it super sophisticated and lightweight, easy to access. Yep.
Excuse me. So like, finding the head is kind of like within the second from the right.
Oh yeah. Let's talk about that a little bit. So if we were to use this as a metaphor for kind of what head, like compositing at a head, imagine you have your image of your head on like a webcam, and then imagine there's an image here that gets rendered behind the scenes, and your head is green only, just a green shape of your head, and then the wall behind you is like purple. So the computer will see green head, purple background, and then anywhere that's purple, it'll just be maybe a blurred image of your wall, or maybe a different illustration, or like if you want to do a cool background. And everything that's green, that's your head, that stays intact. So it's just your head. Yep. It does compositing steps. So typically the way it'll render that out is it'll have your video feed, and then it'll have a separate layer. So it's like this. It's kind of deferred rendering type thing, just like at the pixel level. It'll have the full image, then it'll have the cutout of your head, then it'll have sometimes just the cutout of the background, or maybe it'll just render the whole image again a different way. And then it'll composite. So like your head, there'll be the layer with your head with transparency around it, and then that slaps onto whatever you want in the back. So typically it at least splits into two, and there's probably that invisible layer of just like the 0 to 1 value. It may not be colorful like this, it might just be black and white. Like your head would be white, everything else is black, and then whatever is white will just be the video feed with the like masking, and then everything else that was black, you do whatever you want. Cool. Well, with that, I think that's everything for the overview. Another little note is that a lot of the software that you can use to create stuff is free, and some of it you can even just do on the web. So like this is an example of like a web program that lets you sculpt. So you can go take a pen, tablet, or your like phone, and then you can start sculpting like clay on your computer on a browser. So you don't even need special software. You could just load this website, sculpt, and export out like 3D models that you can render somewhere else. Same with like this like 3JS over there. There's other things like it, but it's like a game engine that works entirely on the web. So you don't have to install any special software. You just host a website essentially with all your 3D assets and like logic, and then you can share your 3D experience, games, whatever you want for everyone to see, and all they have to do is click on it in a browser and they can experience your work. So it's easier than ever to create 3D content and share it with the people you care about.